As British troops prepared for war, Prime Minister Anthony Eden was about to address the nation on the Suez crisis.
I got a call in the morning, early in the morning, to say that the Prime Minister wished to make a broadcast. And I was to go to number 10 and direct it. We drove to Downing Street and asked Sir William Clark, who was his PR man, and I said, what's going on? And he said, I don't know. I think the old man has gone mad.
It was one of the most important broadcasts of Eden's political career. With the fate of his regime in the balance, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser also broadcast to his people.
سنقاتل زي ما قلت امبارح لآخر نقطة دم ولن نسلم أبداً.
All of us had a gun at home so that when they entered Cairo, we would shoot from the windows. Well, I was terrified, absolutely terrified.
The next 3 days of bloody battle and momentous political struggle would define Britain's future on the world stage. He had been Churchill's foreign secretary during the Second World War. But Anthony Eden did not appear to be coping well with the current crisis.
He was in the bed, sitting up. But what was very alarming was that on the shelf at the back of the bed, there were whole lines of pills in bottles. And he looked dreadful. I mean, he was very ill.
Do come in, David. What we did was to take police action.
Obviously his health was, from the physical strain of the whole thing, was not getting any better. But personally, I don't think it in any way affected his judgment.
I certainly got the impression that it was personal between him and Nasser.
Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal Company, then jointly owned by Britain and France. As part of a secret deal with the British and French governments, Israeli paratroops had attacked Egypt, and now British planes were bombing Egyptian airfields. An international crisis was enveloping Downing Street.
I felt as if Suez Canal was flowing through my drawing room, because the whole of Downing Street was awash with Suez, morning, noon and night for weeks and weeks on end.
To end the fighting and to separate the armies.
The only contribution I made was in the view of all the cabinet sitting there. It was I who said, look, I do think, Prime Minister, that if you're going to give a good performance this afternoon in a few hours' time, you really ought to rest.
Very well, if you think it best. Would you all mind?
Very well, he said, and we all filed out.
Good evening. I know that you would wish me, as Prime Minister, to talk to you tonight on the problem which is in everybody's mind.
Eden's wife was aware of just how important the broadcast was.
She looked at the picture on the monitor, and it looked very washed out. And with like sort of 10 seconds to go, or a minute to go, before I was going to be on the air speaking to the world, she said, it's a conspiracy, nobody can see the Prime Minister's moustache. And she took out some eye mascara and darkened his moustache. And it was touching, really. She had a deep affection for him, and he was very ill.
He was so determined to go on, you know, he just charged on.
All my life I've been a man of peace. Working for peace, striving for peace, negotiating for peace. And I'm still the same man, with the same conviction, the same devotion to peace. I couldn't be other, even if I wished. But I'm utterly convinced that the action we have taken is right. There are times for courage, times for action. And this is one of them. Good night to you all.
I remember him saying to me after the broadcast, you know, people say we should have done this earlier, but actually we couldn't. I couldn't get forces there to the canal in time.
The Egyptians were preparing for an all-out Anglo-French invasion. Thousands of weapons were distributed to Egypt's civilian population.
What they did is they asked us all to train to shoot guns. And we had the old Lee and Enfield guns still in those days. And they gave me one and they took me to training to shoot. I said, why do you want me to shoot on what? They said, when they enter Cairo, you have to stand in your balcony and shoot on the invading troops. I said, but if I shoot at somebody, first of all, I'm unlikely to hit anyone because I'm a very bad shot. Secondly, they'll shoot back at me and destroy the whole building where we're living. I mean, what's the point? That's an idiotic thing. I'm not going to win this war.
In Britain, not everyone agreed with Eden's tough stance on Suez. The day after the broadcast, the Labour Party organised a massive protest in Trafalgar Square.
I remember the loudspeaker vans calling out. They went down these narrow brick streets, you know, law, not war. You know, come to the demonstration, Trafalgar Square, law, not war. I knew it would be big, and it was enormous. The only speech I remember is in Iron Bevan. We found ourselves laughing all the time at the great Bevan speech.
Sir Anthony Eden is sincere in what he is saying, and he may be. He may be. Then, if he is sincere in what he is saying, then he is too stupid to be a Prime Minister.
Bevan was having an anti-Suez rally in Trafalgar Square, and I was just sitting in Downing Street, and I thought I might go up and have a look. And walked up to Trafalgar Square, and I stood on the edge of the crowd. And after a bit, some of the people on the edge kind of recognized me. And of course, the ones on the edge of the crowd, I suppose, were just curious and passers-by, and they all came rushing round me and saying, you know, good on you and keep it up. And of course, the anti-Suez people were all near Bevan in the middle. But then it got rather kind of noisy, so I thought I'd better go away. It gave me an impression that, you know, most people were still really for Suez.
But the opposition to Eden was more vociferous.
We went down Whitehall to try and get into Downing Street to see Anthony Eden. And then a big riot eventually began, because this was a very determined, very, very angry crowd, and the mounted police began to charge into the crowd. We weren't used to the idea that police could use force. Neither were we used to the spectacle of policemen on horses charging into an unarmed crowd and clubbing down women. That seemed unbelievable. We couldn't believe we were seeing this. We had a trust in government and a trust in the state. And Suez marked the end of that. It marked, suddenly, the realization that the state could be criminal, that a British government could lie, cheat, and commit unforgivable aggression.
In Cairo, Nasser watched pictures of the Trafalgar Square riot with satisfaction. He revealed his contempt for the British Prime Minister to a close confidant.
إيدن ضعيف الشخصية
ضعيف في موقفه داخل حزبه وداخل حكومته، ضعيف في موقفه قدام بلاده. وزي العديد من الرجال الضعفاء بينجذب لفكرة القيام بعمل عنيف.
Any further delay, even by 24 hours, will make it far more difficult to resume military operations afterwards. And if we do continue...
As the demonstration raged outside, Eden now held the most crucial cabinet meeting of the crisis. The only pretext for the invasion was to intervene in the war between Israel and Egypt. But it now looked as if the Israelis were going to accept a United Nations ceasefire. The cabinet had to decide whether to go ahead with the invasion.
I propose we move to vote.
Eden asked the cabinet formally to indicate their views.
I am for proceeding with military.
Most of the cabinet were in favor of going ahead with the invasion, but 2 were for calling it off and 4 were for postponement. Among the high-profile dissenters was leader of the House and influential Tory, Rab Butler. Jane Williams, one-time secretary to Winston Churchill, is Rab Butler's niece. She was living with her uncle during the Suez Crisis.
Rab was totally exasperated. He also felt that he was being excluded from the whole situation. His opinions were not asked, he was ignored, and he was very, very dubious about the wisdom of the whole operation. He felt that sending in troops was not the right thing to do. He felt that strongly, and he thought it would end in disaster.
With the cabinet divided, Eden reportedly adjourned the meeting to await news of the possible Israeli ceasefire.
I think it best if we adjourn for a few moments to allow me to consider my position.
He would say, you know, all of us were deeply worried about Anthony. People do criticize him. They wonder whether he's up to the job. And it seemed to me that it was strangely unsympathetic to Eden.
News from New York. The Israelis have not agreed to a ceasefire on terms acceptable to the United Nations.
Bravo! May I now assume that we unanimously agree to continue with the initial phase of our operation and airborne landings tomorrow morning?
With no ceasefire, momentum for invasion was unstoppable, and the cabinet swung behind Eden's fateful decision. The omens looked good for the Anglo-French campaign. The Egyptian army was already suffering at the hands of Israeli troops. Despite the defeats, support for Nasser in Egypt remained strong. This was a blow for Eden, who hoped that military reverses would topple Nasser's regime.
Regime change was always part of the policy, but never avowed. And this, of course, is one of the extraordinary similarities with Iraq, that in both cases there was a dual objective, the second one being a regime change, but the second one was never avowed on either occasion. But in order to achieve that, a pretext was necessary for the launching of the operation in both cases. And in both cases, a certain amount of deception was practiced in order to achieve the pretext.
Daybreak on November the 5th.